Well, one of our most important issues after all of this discussion about how to authenticate hadith and finding which hadiths are strong, probably the first substantive issue we want to talk about in hadith application is the use of weak or inauthentic hadith, which is often rampant in discussions. And again, that is kind of unfortunate and ironic given the efforts that the scholars have put forth to differentiate the hadiths in terms of strength and weakness. And as we discussed in Module 1, there are at least 5 classifications. The strongest of all of the hadith ahad is the sahih lidhatihi, sahih or authentic for itself. It meets all of the 5 conditions for authenticity. Now the second category is sahih lighayrihi, sahih or authentic because it gets corroboration. We never really fleshed out what that means in Module 1, but an example would be that a hadith is narrated through multiple chains, say 2 or 3 chains. Each of them examined on its own would only be hasan, fair or good. But if both chains, or all 3 chains, are hasan, then they corroborate each other, and then the scholars consider that that hadith is now sahih lighayrihi. It's sahih because of something else, because of corroboration. The third category is hasan lidhatihi, fair to good because of itself. And then hasan lighayrihi, fair or good because it again received corroboration. And that would again be multiple chains of the same hadith, each of them not quite sufficient to be called hasan, but all together would then make that hadith hasan lighayrihi, hasan because of corroboration, and that would be the weakest level of acceptable hadiths. Below that are all of the weak hadiths. Either they are weak in the chain, so we don't have enough to authenticate them, or the scholars believe that they are actually fabricated. So the munkar and mawdu'a would be in that category. So one big problem we have in Islamic discourse is that often speakers do not pay attention to these sorts of classifications. And they find a hadith in a hadith book and then go ahead and quote it. So this issue, of course, should be self-evident, but when you mix in Islamic circles enough, you realize that there's a lot of use of weak or inauthentic hadiths, with the speaker either having incomplete information or, worse yet, incomplete disclosure in using the hadith to support his or her position. So let us just take a couple of examples. And these hadiths will be relating to women, since women's rights is an issue now in the Muslim world. And so the first hadith has been reportedly used in khutbahs in various Muslim countries. That on the authority of Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet, peace be upon him, she said, "The woman should not see anyone, nor should anyone see her." And the Prophet concurred with her and hugged her, saying, "A lineage one from another." And that would be an expression sort of similar to like father, like daughter. Another narration of this hadith is that the Prophet asked his daughter Fatima, "What is the best for a woman?" And then she replied that she not see anyone, nor anyone see her. And the Prophet kissed her and said, "A lineage from another." A lineage one from another. Although this hadith is widely quoted, Sheikh Muhammad al-Ghazali of Al-Azhar University said regarding it to a man who quoted it, quote, "You are quoting a munkar, rejected hadith, not mentioned in any respectable hadith book. You quote a hadith which contradicts what is known with certainty from the Quran and the mutawatir hadiths and the seerah of the Prophet and the caliphs." Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, also commenting on this hadith, made a statement to the effect that it is not worth the ink spent to write the isnad which was concocted for it. So you have two of our leading scholarly authorities coming out and very clearly attacking this hadith, and that tells us that this hadith was circulated widely enough that they needed to respond to it. Let's look at a second hadith. On the authority of the companion Anas, transmitted through Ibrahim ibn Hudbah, the Prophet said, "Whenever a woman leaves her house without the order of her husband, she will merit God's anger until she returns to her house or until he forgives her." Now this hadith is classified as outrightly fabricated by the hadith scholars. The narrator, Ibn Hudbah, has been called a liar and a fabricator by numerous hadith scholars. And this is discussed by the eminent modern authority on hadith, Sheikh Muhammad al-Albani, in his classic book, Silsilat al-Ahadith al-Da'ifa wal-Mawdu'a wa Atharaha al-Sayyi fi al-Ummah. A collection of weak and fabricated hadiths and their detrimental effect on the Ummah. So, if the above two hadiths were accepted as authentic, or if the listener didn't realize that they were weak, it's clear that they would have a profoundly detrimental impact on the status and independence of Muslim women. And so you see that these are not minor issues. Now, with regard to the use of weak hadiths, there may be many issues which wouldn't be suspected by the general Muslim or the non-specialist in hadith sciences. For example, somebody may quote from a very respected book like the Muwatta of Imam Malik without noting that many of the hadiths there are mursal hadiths. And if you remember, mursal means that the companion who related directly from the Prophet is missing from the chain. Or they may be opinions of the companions that are put in the Muwatta, and they may be quoted by the speaker as a hadith of the Prophet simply because they appear in the Muwatta, and a lot of people think of the Muwatta of Malik as a hadith book. Secondly, many ignore the clear opinion of the majority of scholars that a weak or da'if hadith does not constitute a legal proof or hujjah and is generally rejected. Now this is quoted from Professor Kamali's book, Principles of Islamic Jurisprudence. The reasons for this are complex. Sometimes there's simply ignorance about hadith classification, but more problematic are those who argue that some scholars say that weak hadiths are admissible as juristic proof. So you may wonder, if this point is so clear and stated by so many scholars, how could there be any confusion? Well, other than lack of knowledge or carelessness, we note a couple of other possible sources of confusion. One is a confusion about the type of hadiths being discussed by the speaker or by the scholar, and that's a topic that we will take up more fully later, inshallah. But for example, some scholars accept weak hadiths in areas other than legal injunction, such as in the realm of teaching good manners or enjoining good deeds. So their thinking is that if it is not making something halal or haram, we can be a little bit looser, because even if the chain is not so strong, but the hadith is trying to teach people good manners, then what's the harm? And the famous jurist Imam Ibn Hanbal stated, for example, quote, "If we are told hadiths from the Messenger of God concerning what is permissible and forbidden, the sunan and the laws, then we are strict with their isnads. But if we are told hadiths from the Prophet about the virtues of certain acts, what is known in Arabic as fada'il al-a'mal, or what does not create a rule or remove a rule, then we are lax with the isnads." And this is quoted in Professor Jonathan Brown's book, Hadeeth. So as a concrete example, there's a hadith which states, quote, "For a man to teach his child proper manners is better than to give a whole bushel in charity." This hadith has the following chain of transmission. It goes from the Prophet to a companion named Jabir ibn Samura, then to a man named Simak ibn Harb, then to Nasih al-Ajami. Now, this hadith is considered munkar because both Nasih and Simak have been impugned as unreliable transmitters. However, although it is a rejected hadith, some scholars think that it may be acceptable to use such a hadith since it is not being used for making rules of Sharia or for prescribing halal and haram, but simply exhorting and teaching good manners, which is a good thing in any case. So now, what do you think of that rationale? And I'm not taking a side here, I'm just asking you, what do you think? Now, regardless of what you or I might think of that rationale, it's important to note that the allowance which some scholars took for specific types of hadiths, such as manners hadiths, does not extend to other weak hadiths. As stated by Shaykh al-Qaradawi, it, quote, has its place and its conditions. However, many have misused this approach and have thus moved away from the right path and sullied Islam's pure spring. And that's a translated quote from Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. Also, it's important to remember that in the classical period of hadith collection, there was a significant struggle between Ahl al-Hadith and Ahl al-Ra'i. And we will talk a lot more about this later, but the Ahl al-Hadith strongly objected to the use of human reason to judge whether a hadith was sound or not. And they felt that if the chain of transmission is strong, it was the duty of the believer to accept the hadith no matter what it said. In other words, regardless of matn. And inshallah, we will have a lot to say about this topic later. But the issue here among Ahl al-Hadith was that it is not our job to think, does this saying seem reasonable or not reasonable? It is our job to look at the chain of transmission, and if the chain of transmission is strong, then our duty as believers is to believe. That is their thinking. So, for example, several hadith books, including one written by Abdullah, the son of the great Imam Ibn Hanbal, and a book called Kitab al-Tawheed, the book attesting to God's oneness, by Ibn Khuzaymah, who also, by the way, compiled a book of Sahih hadiths known as Sahih of Ibn Khuzaymah. They include a hadith describing how when God sits on his throne, it squeaks like a saddle mounted by its rider. Abdullah notes that the isnad of the hadith is weak, and later scholars denounced Ibn Khuzaymah's book. So why did these scholars quote weak hadiths? Well, Professor Jonathan Brown provides a very interesting answer. And this is in his book Hadith, page 37. These footnotes are in your syllabus. And I'll quote directly from him. Authors of books of Sunnah were arguing that instead of relying on reason, Muslims should believe in material transmitted from the Prophet no matter what it said. A hadith about God's throne squeaking was as useful in this cause as more reliable hadiths. End quote. Thus, when the door was open to using weak hadiths for one motivation or another, it was hard to close when it came to rules and obligations and halal and haram. And another significant point is that some misunderstand or misrepresent the point of view of great scholars, again claiming that they support the use of weak hadiths, using quotes like the following from Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who is reported to have said, "You hardly see anyone applying reason, ra'i, to some issue of religion or law, except there lies in his heart some deep-seated resentment. An unreliable narration from the Prophet is thus dearer to me than the use of reason." Now, using quotes like this, some would say that Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal accepts da'if or weak hadiths to make religious law. However, anyone who uses that or similar examples ignores the fact that in the first 2 centuries there were essentially only 2 classes of hadith, strong and weak, without the intermediate grade of Hasan or good and acceptable fair hadiths. Thus, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal classified the hadith into Sahih or Da'if only, rather than Sahih, Hasan, and Da'if. So, the category of Da'if, in his view, applied to hadiths which were relatively close to being Sahih, and included many hadiths which were classified as Hasan by other scholars. And overlooking this fact has caused some people to misunderstand or misrepresent the views of Imam Ibn Hanbal. So, as you move forward in your study of hadith, it's important to know 2 issues. Number 1, all of Module 1 was about how do we authenticate strong hadiths, and therefore, in our discussions, we really, particularly about laws, halal, haram, we should be using strong hadiths. And often that doesn't happen. And so our first issue in thinking about how do we apply the hadith is to just take a beat, take a step, and say, is this hadith even strong to begin with? And it's important to know that the opinion of our scholars in general has been that weak hadiths, although they may have merit in giving lessons in manners, advising good deeds, etc., are not used as the basis of legal injunctions and obligations or in deciding what is halal and haram in Islam. All right, so that concludes this lecture then on the issue of weak hadiths, and we'll see you in the next lecture, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.